So again, the bottom line up front coming out of those analyses conducted over the span of about 10 months was the highest probabilistic inference is that these individuals were exposed to some kind of energy. And at that time, it was most strongly agreed that the type of energy was primarily some form of sonic energy, ultrasonic energy that may or may not have an acoustic artifact. And some of these individuals heard what they called a sound, a chirping, a ringing, but it was not uniform. And there were some reasons for that. So based upon that, my initial report was that these individuals either had some artifact or some direct interface with some type of ultrasonic energy. Again, either on their job, something that they were doing, a surveillance device, an interference device, or something that they were exposed to, either unintentionally or intentionally. And the intentionality there could be multifold. It could be that there was some form of surveillance device that was working along that sonic frequency range that just had this incidental effect upon them. And that was not intentional. It was not necessarily physically directed. It could have been that there was, in fact, something physically directed, and that was the intent, or it could have been a combination of both. Yeah. Now, about a year later, continuing the analysis based upon direction, let's dig into this a little bit further, and based upon some information that had initially been classified, but then was declassified, and other information that came to us through something called confidential and classified information channels, the initial suspect was that it could also be something along the electromagnetic spectrum other than ultrasonic. But initially, I had ruled that out. The idea that it could have been perhaps something microwave.
I was going to ask you what that.
But the initial rule out there was based upon three sort of exclusory factors. The first was that it takes a lot of power to drive a directable microwave. I mean, a lot. This is not something that could be done clandestinely or covertly. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you need something the size of a laundry truck. I mean, it requires a big dish and a lot of power to drive a microwave, particularly to be able to affect someone at a distance. Number two, well, obviously, not only does that require something that is very, very large to drive the power source, but it also requires something very large to get it within range. And again, you need to be within about 30 yards. So this is not something you can hide behind a mailbox, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the third aspect is that these types of conventional microwaves that would be delivered that way would have a thermal signature to them. So it's not just a question of the disruptive effect of the microwave, which has definitively disruptive effects on neurological structure and function, on metabolism, on cell structure, on a variety of different physiological processes, but it's going to have a thermal signature. And the only viable constraint on each one of those factors would have been if the microwaves could have been exceedingly rapidly pulsed. Now, I'm not a microwave physicist. I'm a neuroscientist. I mean, certainly much of the neurophysics and biophysics falls within my sandbox. And certainly those things that work within the energy spectrum fall within my sandbox as well. But the state-of-the-art microwaves in terms of what was being done internationally, both here in the United States and with the United States international economic and scientific allies and among peer competitors, was not within my first orbit of acquisition. However, working with colleagues that I was then vectored to because of my work at that time with Special Operations Command here in the United States, allowed me to gain information that revealed that, in fact, there are ways that such microwaves could be used in a way that allowed them to be scalable and therefore very fieldable, and in that way, highly operationalizable. And the secret sauce in that equation was the use of lasers to rapidly pulse the microwave delivery at an exceedingly rapid rate. I mean, we are talking at essentially hundreds of thousands of fractions of a second.
Wow.
So we're looking at the very, very low nanoscale to sub-nanoscale of seconds in time, which would then require a significantly less power source to be able to drive the microwave, a significantly smaller evaluative power source to be able to drive that microwave, which could then be contained and scaled, which would then allow this to be then delivered not necessarily in long distances, but certainly relatively short distances of up to 20 to 30 yards. But that combination of scalability, both of the power source and of the actual device itself, also then lent to fieldability. So in other words, you could get that thing into the field, and you could use it in a way that would be clandestine. And if in fact you then moved it out of the way, relatively covert, and that lent to its operationalizability. But there's one additional factor. The thermal artifact that's characteristically produced by microwaves can be constrained by the duration of the microwave pulse. The shorter the pulse, the less thermal artifact. So although there would be some thermal disruption, it would probably be not significant enough to be subjectively experienced by the individuals who were certainly getting the objective effect of network disruption, physiological disruption caused by the electromagnetic disruptive effect of the microwaves that were being rapidly pulsed in pulse trains. So we then went back in late 2018 and 2019 and revised the original set of reports in an addended set of reports that then provided information to suggest or strongly support the coupled probability that it could be either or some form of ultrasonic energy exposure or some form of microwave exposure. And as I said, or perhaps some combination of both, either used sequentially, utilized in combination, whatever. And what was important to understand is that an important factor, a critical factor in coming to that probabilistic conclusion is the reality of the technological availability and readiness levels of these types of devices and these types of tools. In other words, this wasn't just pulling something out of the air a la Star Trek. Part of the evaluative and assessment analytics went into, well, are there currently viable devices that are at this level of sophistication and capability that would be available for these types of uses by virtue of existing patents, by CRADAs, in other words, research development agreements, literature that existed in the commercial and industrial literature, some of it existing within intellectual property domains that then had to be surveilled, and others, in terms of the information that was available, coming from classified sources, or at very, very least, sources that were less than uniformly available. Right. So given those factors and this convergence of factors, at this point, and at the end of 2019, the final set of reports that I submitted was that there was the very, very high probability, based upon high evidentiary certainty and convergence, that these individuals had been exposed to some form of energy, directable energy, and that based upon evaluation of their working environment, it didn't seem to occur at their working environment, therefore it was probably nothing that they were doing. Perhaps it was something they may have been inadvertently exposed to, but then based upon the pattern of exposure and based upon the pattern of who was being exposed, there seemed to be at least some measure of potential intentionality. Now, that intentionality and that attribution did not fall within my pay grade. That was not what I was tasked with. And the one thing you learn to do when you're doing this kind of work, which again, I've been doing for decades, is you color between the lines. You stay in your lane. What I was asked to do is, what could do this? And given what could do this, do these things exist? And do these things exist at a level that would allow them to be scaled and operationally utilized? And then also part of that was the assessment of the technology readiness and, if you will, global economics. In other words, who's got these toys? Who's got these tools? Right. And of course, the issue there is, yes, we, the United States and our international allies, both scientific and technological as well as military allies, certainly have dedicated efforts towards these technologies in a variety of different ways, not all of them military, by the way, as well as our trans-Pacific peer competitors and our transatlantic peer competitor. And there was evidence that the dual usability of these techniques and technologies was in fact attributable to peer competitor, at least programs, if not operations, as far back as 2010, 2012. So timelines convergent, technology convergence, situational convergence. Again, so the nature of those reports was such that clearly the reports filed from late 17, 18, 19, and then into 2020 were strongly supportive of the direct probability that these individuals had been exposed to some form of energy disruption.